All right, folks, we are live. We've got our panelists, we've got our attendees. We are on Facebook. Adam, you want to get us started?
For sure. Welcome everybody to the March on Milwaukee digital series. We've been doing conversations at noon, over the lunch hour throughout May when we focused on the open housing marches, throughout June when we focused on Latinx history, and July we've been looking at food, inspired by really what we're missing from a typical Milwaukee or Wisconsin summer, which is festivals, being outdoors, being with community, and also eating a bunch of food. We've had a great conversation about Walker's Point and gentrification, about Mitchell Street last week. Today, the title of our event is From Southeast Asia to Southeast Wisconsin, SAPSAP, LAO, and Hmong culture. That also could be Southeast Milwaukee. But yeah, let's move to the next slide. And today, let's just jump right into it. We have three remarkable panelists who agreed to be with us. And why don't, we're going to get a little bit more into your stories as we move forward, but if you all wouldn't mind, let's have you each introduce yourselves. Just give us a snapshot of who you are and what you do. And let's start with MAYHOUA.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is MAYHOUA MOUA, and I'm with the Milwaukee Consortium for Hmong Health. And what we do is we try to reach out to the Southeast Asian population to educate them about cancer, specifically to breast, cervical, and liver cancer, and chronic diseases such as hypertension and diabetes, which are very common in our Southeast Asian population.
All right, thank you, MAYHOUA. Alex, do you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Alex HANESAKDO, owner and operator of SAPSAP. We're kind of like a Southeast Asian-driven food company that does wholesale, pop-up dinners, not no more though, but we've been doing curbside pickup this past few months and been doing pretty well. We're located here in Racine, Wisconsin, but we do events in Milwaukee, a lot of collaborations with other chefs. Looking to do some really awesome things coming up next year, so yeah.
All right, cool. And we're going to get more into your story as we move forward. And then last but not least, Dr. THAO. Thanks for being with us, even as you're traveling to close on a house.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I am actually a medical anthropologist. I did my PhD in anthropology from the University of Minnesota. And so when I met Rob, I was actually a postdoctoral fellow at the Medical College of Wisconsin. But my new role, starting August, is assistant professor and director of Hmong studies at UW-Oshkosh.
Very cool. Excellent. So we caught you in a moment of like multiple transitions, not like the world's in transition and you're in some personal ones as well.
Yeah, it's quite crazy, but that's just how it is.
Well, we thank you three for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Why don't we, Keisha, let's move to the next slide. Absolutely.
So, we're missing out on some of the most fun and engaging events and developments that occur here in Milwaukee, and that's our festivals. And so what we like to do for our conversations is to get attendees, both those who are in our Zoom conversation and those on Facebook Live, we want to get them involved right away. And so we like to start with a question that encourages that participation. And what we like to share today and what we like to hear from folks today is what's missing in this COVID moment? What is the summer activity or the summer festivals or the experiences over the summer in Milwaukee that you're missing? I'll start. I just like the entire vibe of the summer because any given day, any given week, you can be driving through the city and bump into a festival. There's fireworks every day, it seems like. There's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday concerts in the park. There's all kinds of activities. And so the vibe of the summers in Milwaukee are certainly an experience that I just did not realize until I moved here. And so it's a great feel, and we're missing that. And so I miss the entire vibe of the summer. Anybody else want to jump in and talk a little bit about what we're missing in this COVID-19 moment?
For me, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, I miss music, gatherings, barbecues, festivals, um, our dining events, more importantly. Yeah, just, you know, the elements of nature when it's summertime, and that social gathering is, you know, kind of been my thing that I really miss.
For me, you know, the Hmong community usually have gatherings across the nation during the summertime with sports tournaments. And that's where a lot of vendors come to sell food, to sell clothings and traditional clothings, and artists come in and perform. And so, you know, for some reason, food is always best at these events. And that's where, you know, many of the Hmong community really enjoyed going out to socialize with people. And so that's something that we miss now, especially this year. And then, of course, there's still family gatherings at parks or for graduation celebrations or birthdays. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of things that, you know, usually happen is not happening this year, including our one Asian festival that we have at Silver City on the south side. That's another big event that, you know, we can own as a community, and it's not happening this year either.
You know, actually, that was what I was going to say, was that exact festival, the Silver City International Festival. And real quick, I'm going to do a screen share because I have some photos that last year I took some of these photos. We, at the the Silver City International Festival, we got a vintage couch out into the street and we just started taking photos of people. This was with Neighborhood News Service, where I also work behind the scenes. And that festival truly is international. You get people of all backgrounds coming out into the street. There's my neighbor Pa and her husband Jeff. But yeah, this is, I mean, doesn't this seem like this is so forbidden?
Right, absolutely.
like even the idea of like bringing a couch out and asking people, like your neighbors, to sit on it, they'd be like, are you going to spray it down between each person? So
right.
yeah,
Dr. THAO, what are your thoughts? What are some things you're missing these days?
Well, I think so I've only been in Milwaukee for 2 years, and I unfortunately haven't been able to get out or get to enjoy the summers here in Milwaukee. But when I was an undergrad at UW-Madison, I'd come out here to visit my sister. So I remember Asian Moon Festival, for Summerfest. And so I was actually really looking forward to doing that. And I have 2 little girls. And so kind of, you know, being able to take your kids to enjoy the things that you grew up enjoying, you know, just really missing that kind of aspect of it.
Awesome. Thank you all so very much. We've got some folks in the chat telling us that they just miss watching people by the lake and all the activity that occurs down by the lake. And apparently some of that's still occurring, but obviously not in the same ways that we would have in previous summers. So thanks, Lisa, for sharing that. Cool. Let's keep going. You know, a lot of what we want to do is talk about some of these very complicated and complex issues, but to do so in a way that's informal so that the young people who then experience these conversations can think about them in very complex ways and learn a little about them. So we'll be talking a little bit about human migration, movements of people, both in and around the nation and into the nation as well. But that also gets us into conversations about urban development and planning and the potential destructive components associated with gentrification, or in some ways, the ways that gentrification might be seen as not necessarily challenging. But ultimately, we're getting into talks and conversations about culture, about neighborhoods, about communities here in our city. And as much as we've been labeled fairly a segregated city, it's also a very richly, culturally dense set of experiences that if you don't live here in the city, you wouldn't know are occurring. And so we'll talk about some of these issues, but we'll keep them accessible so that our young people who tune in can understand the complexities associated with these topics.
All right. We're ready to get into it. So
Take us away, Adam.
This first section on food and culture, we're going to ask Alex to, I'll use some food puns, kind of share some of the ingredients of his own personal story and his family story. And obviously, Dr. THAO and MAYHOUA, feel free to be part of this conversation. Food, oftentimes, no matter where you are, is part of the journey that you have learning and navigating your own culture, and also evolves over time. And I know that's true for you, Alex. Actually, so can you just start? The way that we met was like a little bit over a year ago from a breakdancing event. So can you let's start with breakdancing. Talk a little bit about your history. We'll get to food, but tell us a little bit of how that entered into your life.
It's kind of weird how this all is woven together, but I got introduced to breakdancing through my cousin that lives in Milwaukee. My family was living in Burlington, Wisconsin at the time. And so he'd come over like every weekend. My dad would go see him because there was really no LAO people in the town that we lived in. My dad's family, my mom's family, and their friends were up on the north side of Milwaukee. So we were like literally every weekend, we'd either be up in Milwaukee or, my cousin would come down here. They introduced me to the culture. I like just attached onto it. I was like, wow, really, really like motivated to be a really good dancer. My parents were like, what the hell are you doing? But it was a culture for us kids coming up. This was like pre-internet too. So moving forward from there, a lot of kids were doing it in Milwaukee on the north side and south side. And I was just surprised that all these other kids were doing it. And I was always a competitive kid and I always wanted to be better than everyone else. A little bit stubborn too. So like we would always practice wherever to try to beat the next crew. And the crews up there were, predominantly Hmong, LAO, and Puerto Rican. I'm not sure how it was on the north side, but so that kind of got me introduced to the whole Milwaukee breakdancing scene. Was late 90s, early 2000s. And I just kind of formed relationships with people in that city through breaking. And the older ones, I don't want to say OGs, but the older people that were breaking before us, like the Ramones and Swifts, they were working at community centers up there. Milwaukee Christian Center being one of them on 21st and Greenfield. That's no longer there right now, but that's where every kid went to go break and practice on Monday and Wednesdays. And as I got older, I started working for these nonprofits under Raymond at the Latino Community Center, Milwaukee Christian Center. I'm not sure if you know who Sarah Dahlhausen is.
I know Sarah. Sarah's my neighbor. I live on 29th and Scott. She's like 2 blocks from me.
True School. You gonna talk about True School?
Yeah. So Sarah was, I worked under Sarah at Latino Community Center. So she brought me in and really gave me like the not really the confidence, but planted something in my head where I'm like, I want to work with kids. So I worked with True School. Before it was True School, I was working with Sarah for a while. Then we started our own nonprofit here called Sweatshop, which is, we teach little kids how to break. And that kind of while I was doing that, I was always in the food. Sorry, this is all over the place, but it's a crazy.
Oh,
that's right. It's good.
So grew up in the Milwaukee scene, made a lot of connections. But then I had the idea to start Mama's Egg Rolls, which my mom was making egg rolls for her work. I'm sure Mai and everyone else can vouch for this. Like your grandma or your aunts will make egg rolls for the neighbors and their factory workers. And that kind of sparked the idea of let's try to go wholesale or cater Mom's Egg Rolls. So that happened. And ironically, we use our breaking network, our hip hop network, to sell these egg rolls.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of how Mama's Egg Rolls birthed, by selling these egg rolls at breaking jams. And so everyone kind of knew me as A-Flex the Breaker, but the guy that sells his mom's egg rolls. So
which were you better at?
Your breakdancing name was A-Flex?
Yeah.
Oh, we going with that for the rest of the talk today, Alex. Come on, A-Flex.
Was A-Flex a better chef or breaker?
Definitely a better breaker then.
But your joints are probably a little older now, not as
Yeah, it's more teaching kids correct technique now than just do repetitions of it, you know. But where was I? Yeah, so we would use our breaking network and community to kind of promote Mama's Egg Rolls, and we'd be at all the battles, Chicago, Racine, Milwaukee, and I was A-Flex Mama's Egg Rolls, and then the whole idea of SAPSAP kind of birthed out of that, because egg rolls are not really a Lao thing, I'd say, or a Southeast Asian thing, but they are that food item that gets people to open the door for like Westerners to try the other food. I mean, my mom never rolled egg rolls for her own personal pleasure. They would always be to make money off of them, or she knew I had non-Lao friends coming over because they're deep fried. They're let's just say they're universal to the Western palate. They're familiar with the Western palate. So she never made them for herself. And I wanted to introduce more actual Lao products to Mama's Egg Roll. So obviously we had to change the name to SAPSAP. SAPSAP meaning kind of like delicious in the Lao language. So after that, we kind of we started making sausage. We started making hot sauce. Then we started.
Actually, you know what? I am gonna move over then to some of the excellent photos that you guys have taken, because just what you said. Can you actually talk just a little about your logo a little bit?
Okay.
Did the imagery there? What was the decision on the?
Yeah. So the person that designed it, he's actually a Lao graphic designer. His name is V. He's responsible for the Snow White's Revenge with the apple. So I don't know if you guys know that, but anyways, so when I was tossing this idea around him, I was born in a refugee camp, and literally this symbolizes my mom carrying her and making food.
Yeah.
Because as a kid, that's what happened, and I kind of wanted to have the logo symbolize literally like what my mom was doing, the struggle she went through, and her food.
And I imagine within the Lao Hmong community, that's like a story a lot of people know. Like, that's not just your story. That's one. MAYHOUA or Dr. THAO, do you guys want to jump in a little bit and talk about what's going through your head so far as we walk through, as we break through Alex's story here? We pop lock through his journey.
Sure. And I can relate to what Alex was saying because, my family moved here to Milwaukee in the 90s, well, in 1990. And that was when breakdancing was very popular with our young people. And so, yes, I see a lot of that with the Hmong, Lao, African Americans, and our Hispanic neighbors. I mean, the young people were always dancing everywhere. And so I relate to that as to also, especially with the picture here, with SAPSAP's picture here, when you see it, you can relate directly with it. That's how most mothers are. While they're cooking, their children are always on their back or in the front, depending on what they're cooking or making. These are things that reminds us. We see the picture and we all relate to it, whether it's within our own culture or our neighbors, or and between the Hmong and the Lao. We all grew up together in Laos, and then having to migrate here as refugees, living in refugee camps, and then starting all over here in the United States. It's been a journey. It's been a very interesting journey. It's a lot of good stories. Many of them are sad, but I hope that our children will come and ask us and our elders about our stories so that they can know, because not everybody's story is written down and it's not in the textbooks at the schools.
Sure.
And so these are things that are very important to us as immigrants and refugees, especially because we didn't choose to come here. We really had no choice. When we lost our country, I was 6 years old. Very young, don't understand very much of what's going on. All I remember was that, my parents said it's time to pick up and go. We just pick up and go, and I just remember having to hold on to my one of my younger sister, hand while my mother carried my baby brother and my dad held my other younger sister. There were four of us when Lao fell. And so having to migrate from the central part of Laos into Vientiane to the Mekong River, and then trying to cross the Mekong River at very early dawn so that we were not caught. And then, living in camps where many families were living under these huge military tents. And we'd had to wait until the military trucks would come by to deliver food for us. And so, and then, coming from there to where we are now in the United States, we've come a long way, but to still hold on to these traditions and to be able to share it with our children, and to have young people like Alex to come back and really want to come to embrace the Lao food and the Lao culture is something that I myself, and I'm sure his parents are very proud of, because sometimes we feel like our culture will be lost because our children will be too Americanized. But to have our children come back and embrace our culture, our languages, and our food is very good. It makes us very proud.
I'm gonna scroll up a little bit as we keep moving. Keep going.
Absolutely, Dr. THAO, talk to us a little bit about the work you're doing and some of your thoughts about migration experiences more broadly, and help contextualize this for us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think what everybody is sharing is really wonderful. I was actually thinking, I didn't say earlier that my research interest is on historical trauma and displacement, and specifically around chronic disease. But for me, when I was looking at questions you guys have written, I was reflecting that I feel like Hmong food, and it also sounds like a lot of food in general, is kind of a
She's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, Dr. THAO's mobile, folks, so we'll give her a second to see if her sound comes back. Oh, there we go.
Oh, am I breaking up?
Yeah, just a little bit. Go right ahead. Yeah.
Oh, let me turn off my video, maybe. Is this better?
Yeah,
it is. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and so I'm always really interested in thinking about experiences as also a story of U.S. imperialism in Southeast Asia. So when the French relinquished their Indochina colony, you have this kind of uprising within Southeast Asia, where you have these individuals who really identified with kind of the communist ideologies, right, trying to reclaim back the colony. But you then also have the U.S. intervening in Laos, trying to shape the political outcome of. It really funneled in a lot of money to sway people to vote pro-American, pro-democracy, but the government actually voted for, the people of Laos actually voted for a much more neutral stance, which was, which catered to both sides. And so, of money called it economic collapse, and there's wars in Laos. And then, so when I talk about U.S. imperialism in Laos, it's not, it's not like colonialism that we typically see in the textbooks, but it's the extension of war in Southeast Asia. So, at the time, the Geneva Conference had agreed that Laos was supposed to stay neutral, and this was all at the same time the Vietnam War was going on. And so, sorry, I just saw the note that we're going to be concluding in 5 minutes in the next section. But yeah, so for me, I'm really, does the U.S. involvement continue to displace Hmong livelihood, right? So you have USCIA coming into Laos, training Hmong and other Lao ethnic minorities to become proxy fighters, U.S. soldiers, right, fighting this war for the U.S. and for ideals of democracy. And so So it's really interesting for me as an anthropologist coming into the work now and seeing the ways that people talk about Hmong culture as something that's always static and never changes, right? But to look back into that history, you can see that, you know, Hmong were displaced from the highlands, and there was a generation that grew up on U.S. dropped, you know, food aid. So some of them didn't even know how to cultivate or grow rice. And so it's really interesting to see the ways in which the Hmong community has returned to reclaim past practices, but also at the same time to adapt it to their current situation. So I feel very much connected to what you got all shared, and I also think about motherhood because I said I have two little girls. Actually, we welcomed a little baby boy in March, and you know, I think about my entrance into motherhood is very much where I'm also learning a lot of these memories that kind of like what Alex was sharing, right? I'm learning about cooking with my mom for my children and about her memories of the refugee camps and ways in which those memories would have never been available to me, right, if I wasn't a mother myself. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
And Alex, if we could just move through some more of your images. I mean, connecting to what just was said, one of the, you know, regardless of where you come from and where you find yourself, some of the recipes, the relationships to food, how to cook it, how to share it, are things clearly that you were fused into you from your family. And this, you know, it seems to me, pick up the story a little bit. So you started making sausage, and then it seems like it kind of started blossoming from there into other ways of thinking about food and what you wanted to do with it, from like the breakdance battles to the broader community.
Yeah. So since we started wholesaling our product, we kind of wanted to work with local chefs or around the area, connected with a few big names like Tori Miller, and he wanted to carry our product, and that was pretty cool. He does a really good job putting an emphasis on fresh local produce made from Hmong farmers and Lao farmers in Madison. So we just connected right there. Um, um, but yeah, after doing our wholesale side, that's when we started doing our dinners, and um, people would come from all over because they didn't know what Lao food was. I always say if you had Thai food, you had Lao food. Um, and it just snowballed out of control. I mean, our dinner started selling out. And while this was all happening, I kind of was just overwhelmed with like people's interest in Lao culture, not knowing what happened in Laos, why we're here, what's the difference between Hmong, Lao, Khmer, because there's so many ethnicities in Laos, and it confuses the hell out of people, and I don't blame them. But yeah, long story short, like we really wanted to convey what happened in Laos, why my family was here, what food we're eating. Like there's a story behind it. There was a big civil war in Laos, why we're refugees. Like the story could go on, and like as Dr. How am I saying your name again? MAYHOUA? Am I saying that right?
Are you saying Maisi, Dr.?
No, MAYHOUA. Am I saying that right?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, I'm not doctor though. My C is doctor.
Okay. What you were saying earlier, like this, there's so many stories and they're so similar, whether you're Hmong or Lao or just refugees in general, that, you know, we came from a place, we came to a new land without planning for it. Just pack up your stuff and go. The adaptation to a new language, having a lot of trauma too. These were things I never thought of as a kid that my parents went through, you know. But as I got older, I really felt the need that I had to share my parents' story through food.
Here's an interesting question from Dr. Samina Mula that we'd like for the panelists to respond to. She says, I would love to hear from the panelists about how food might repair and heal, whether intergenerational trauma or even in the current pandemic context. How can food play a role in healing and repair?
You know, in the Hmong culture, especially in the Hmong community, we have not left gardening at all. I mean, we come from an agricultural background, and even adapting to our new environments, we still garden where, even if we just have a little lot or a little yard, we still want to plant something. And so our parents were always gardening, growing something, if not much, at least herbs, at least some green mustard, so that because those are our everyday food that we ingredients that we put into our food. And so to us, that's very very cultural, where um, our elders feel very at home, if even if they're in a new environment. At least they can still eat their traditional food. At least that's a piece of them that will live with them forever. And growing up, my mother came from a more prominent monk background, where she was the youngest of her siblings in that my maternal grandmother gave birth to. Because my grandfather, I don't know if you know much about the Hmong culture, but our culture practiced polygamy. And so my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had 3 wives, and my grandmother was the first wife. And so my mother was the youngest daughter of my grandmother's, and so she had the opportunity to attend school back in Laos, where her older sisters had to work around the house and garden with the family. And so, not having to garden her entire life, I was not taught how to garden until I married my husband. And then, and my parents-in-law are much older than my parents. And so that's when I started learning to garden with my parents-in-law and garden with them. And so now, I'm not an expert yet. I'm still learning. I'm just growing a few little things here and there with the help of my sister-in-law. But, to be able to grow your own food and to be able to harvest your food and cook the traditional meals that we normally have is something that's very warming for us. And especially for me now, as I'm getting older and, educating the Southeast Asian population about health, we are always talking about nutrition. And so to us, this is something that we like to resort back to, is grow your own food so that it's organic. Cook your traditional Hmong food because it's most healthy. Because we don't use many spices, and our Hmong food is pretty bland. But I love it because we make our own fresh tea at every meal, especially if you have elders in the home. And so to us, this is what food do for us. It still keeps us with our identity of where we came from, who we are.
I want to jump in there too, to answer Dr. Tamina MOUA's question. It's very interesting because when the Hmong resettled, as well as other Southeast Asians, when they resettled here in the U.S., they were placed into places like Milwaukee that had racial segregation, places of high poverty, high crime. And I actually grew up in rural Wisconsin, where I was only one of 3 families that were the only people of color around. And so in a place where you lose a lot of connection with other people, but also where you grow up as a child not having any connection to the history that's being taught in the grade school, and at the same time experiencing almost a sense of invisibility. Food has a way to create that sense of visibility and that sense of home that I find that is fairly healing. And so, coming into Milwaukee, even though I was here as undergrad, being able to still enjoy Southeast Asian cuisine really made Milwaukee home for me. And I think in terms of kind of like healing intergenerational trauma, I think being able to engage in food generationally really important, because it allows first, second generation people to understand the kind of experiences and memories through food, rather than having to be this conversation where you just have between the elders and the younger generation, but the food becomes the conduit in which you learn about history, learn about your parents' experiences, and that in itself is, I think, quite healing.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you so very much. And as always has been the case over the last several months, we look at several weeks, we look at these images and wonder why we are not somewhere eating right now.
You know, there's so to move into our next portion of our conversation, kind of about place and power. Alex, I have a question for you. So your parents might have kind of had a question mark about you getting into breakdancing. How does your mom like your food?
She's honest.
Nice.
Very honest. I mean, she gets it. She gets what I'm going for. But would she personally eat it? Probably not. Because we do, because we do a lot of fusion dishes, like inspired by LAO ingredients. But she's like very traditional. She likes lap. She likes a really funky papaya salad. Yeah.
And that's kind of what I wanted to get into, sort of the tension that can exist between tradition and kind of history, but then also how sometimes that can sort of that can have tension with forging forward and making your own way, right? Like, so you grew up in these environments, probably learning moves from all kinds of people, like breakdance crews, each have their own flavors or their own styles, and that's just part of how you came up. So can you talk a little bit about navigating that culture between, or navigating the tension between sort of traditional culture and making sure that has a place, but also wanting to author your own story?
Well, I think it's no different than like Italian immigrants coming here and Italian food evolving, right? We're just, I think we're newer. We're a newer group of refugees and immigrants. So you do slowly see like people doing things not traditional, but definitely gain inspiration from the tradition. Like for me, my inspiration is obviously my parents. Having our own garden, we'd literally get, my dad would process tail to nose animals in his backyard with his friends. Definitely being inspired by that, but like trying other things and being influenced by Wisconsin, my Latino friends, all that inspires me. Now, as far as the tension, I don't really get it from anyone besides my own LAO people.
Yeah.
But you know, you're gonna get that, and that's fine. I mean, if they like traditional LAO food, that's great too. It's just I just have my own style on what I do, but for me, yeah, there's really no tension. I mean, I think we're just evolving like any other ethnic group or culture that comes here, and food's gonna change, and food can stay traditional, and that's cool too.
For sure.
But let's stay into this question of fusion, because I think a lot of times we hear the word, we even see the name as part of the names of restaurants and all of that. How do you each think about fusion? And let's go to MAYHOUA and MAYHOUA. What does fusion mean, or how does fusion play out, whether it's food, whether it's culture, family? Talk a little bit about fusion more broadly.
I think my interpretation of fusion is mixing culture, my culture with the society that I live in currently. And so we see a lot of that through food, through our clothing as well. I know that, for us younger generation, we come to a new environment and we like new food as well. And so we put a little twist to the taste of it. Like for example, broccoli is something that I'm not used to seeing that back in Laos, even as a young child. We do have broccoli, but it just doesn't grow into the big green bunch, that we see here. It's more thinner. And so we cook it differently, but coming here, we adapt and use different kinds of vegetables that we are now exposed to cook into our traditional dishes as well. And so to me, that's fusion, adapting to what we can find when we don't have our own. I know that that's what my mother had to do when we first arrived back in the mid 70s. when, you know, we arrived in South Dakota in the middle of nowhere. We were the only Hmong and Asian family within that city. And so, you know, when my mom went grocery shopping for the very first time with the person that was teaching her to go grocery shopping, you know, she see a lot of fruits and vegetables, but the only thing that she recognized are lemon, orange, apple, because we had some of those back in Laos, especially in the city. But broccoli, cauliflowers, those are things that we don't normally grow in Laos. And so we have to learn to adapt to that. And so that's where the fusion for me in my own family and upbringing has learned to do until we have other people that were able to bring seeds over, and now we can grow our own Hmong, we call it like Hmong green mustard, or squash or corn. And so, you know, we eat across culture now.
Dr. THAO, you want to jump in at all? Talk to us a little bit about fusion, whether it's food, culture, experiences.
Yeah, well, so I think for me, it's interesting, kind of going back to what I was saying, that Hmong people are always framed and I actually say are racialized as seen as cultural, right? That our racial difference is made visible only through our cultural practices. And so it often assumes that Hmong people and Hmong tradition has never changed, that we could get at some kind of essence of what Hmong tradition is and will always be. But when you think about kind of the history and the context of Hmong and kind of thinking about the different types of food that Hmong people eat, you can see that you have French influence during, you know, French colonialism of Laos. It's really interesting when I have interviewees who, you know, tell me that they drink coffee and dip their bread in the coffee, you know, which they learned from the French. And you also have Hmong cuisine that is also French inspired. And, you know, at the same time, you know, learning about how Hmong people living in the Thai refugee camps started using oyster sauce, using some of the Thai condiments in the food. So for me, the tension between tradition and fusion is for me, I don't know if it's so much of a tension, but I think it's the idea that tradition never changes. But that's kind of a myth that we like to tell, because tradition has always changed, especially as it's shown through what the other panelists have been saying.
Great, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Go ahead, Adam.
I wanted to share a really quick story that's going to involve a screen share for a moment, which is kind of a different sort of fusion. As Dr. THAO was just mentioning, fusions that kind of happen prior to Lao Hmong folks arriving in the United States, but there's one that I just wanted to walk through this because this is something that I've just sort of stumbled through my own experience of Milwaukee, which is if you go to the corner of 35th and National, you will find yourself next to Vientiane. So that's actually what my stomach is filled with right now, some delicious pho from there that I had leftovers from last night. You have Thai barbecue, and then you also have this spot right here named Bamboo. But right next to that is a Mexican place named Chicken Palace, who sells, among their many offerings, the mango nata. So the mango nata, if you don't know what that is, I'm going to just quickly show you a picture of a Google image search. This is all very fancy, of what a mango nata looks like. And this is actually comes from kind of the Mexican paleteria tradition of, you know, paletas are really big, but then also these kind of ice cream creations. And this is the most elaborate thing you can get at a paleteria around the south side of Milwaukee. And, you know, from my understanding, this where a lot of Hmong folk came when they first came to Milwaukee was in your south side. This was something that a lot of folks just really loved. It matched their palate for what they wanted in dessert. Now, if you were to go, and I'm just going to transit us through this map all the way up to 76th and Mill Road, when you go to a major center of Hmong culture in Milwaukee, the Phong Savang Market, which started, so we're all the way across town up here, where this giant market is. If you were to go into the, I'm not even there yet, it's all the way up here. You would go to that market, one of their best-selling items. If you walk to the back where all the food is, in this market, I'll drop us right here, would be the mango nata. There's in this place, which actually doesn't look like much from the outside, but is a spectacular market with like 100 stalls. In the back, there's a permanent mango nata stand. And then my understanding, actually, you were discussing this before, MAYHOUA, if you were to go to a Tulu competition somewhere out in Wisconsin or even in Minnesota, the longest lines at any of the tables selling food would be for the mango nata, or like that's just become like a really beloved dessert. Alex, you were mentioning, Alex, as our resident chef, can you talk a little bit about the mango nata and kind of your experience with it?
Yeah, when I first had it, they have this tamarind straw in there.
Yeah.
I remember as a kid, when we go to the Asian markets, my dad would always get this tamarind spicy candy, and that's exactly what it reminded me of. That and fresh mangoes, like literally.
Yeah.
So, like when I first time I tried it, it reminded me of my childhood, and I thought tamarind was something unique to Southeast Asia. Like growing up, I had no idea, and that kind of just like opened up so many doors for me to learn about other cuisine, especially Mexican cuisine.
Absolutely. Tamarindo is like a really popular, I mean, tamarind candy is super popular within the Mexican cuisine. So yeah, I think, I mean, just speaking of kind of that conversation of fusion, I really like what you're pointing out, Dr. THAO, which is that culture and tradition aren't static necessarily. They can move. And now, like in some ways, there are probably kids who are growing up in southeastern Wisconsin or all over Wisconsin who are LAO Hmong, who like just know the mango nata is like never, like that's just part of the tradition they're growing up inside of, right? One where fusion has already happened and you keep getting deeper after that. Keisha, can we pull that slide back up? So we're gonna get to the formal Q&A part. If anybody else is interested in asking a question at any point, please do drop that in the chat. Otherwise, before we get to Q&A, just wanted to ask the second question we have on here, just sort of food as a vehicle for creating power within communities. So can you guys talk about that a little bit, of like how you see food as sort of a way of galvanizing some of what might be disparate energies within a community, or just establishing yourself within a broader community?
I'll jump in. So I kind of was wondering about this, the word power, and how are we defining it? Because for me, and my understanding of food, and the practices around food has been about fostering life. And so, for me, I think about the ways in which, if we say power is the ability to foster lives, then I think Hmong food, and the cultural practices that are caught up in it is very much about it. When you meet somebody who's Hmong, you say, "Nyo ka, nyo jong," right? Like, are you eating well? Are you living well? Right? And so those are really important things to think about, and kind of going back to my earlier point about fostering lives. What is it, for a Hmong community to be dropped into Wisconsin, like, or like my family who grew up in rural Wisconsin, in places that, seem counterintuitive to the way that they grew up in Laos. Food has allowed the Hmong community to thrive in ways that I think is surprising and healing. It allows, Hmong families to recreate home, and to re-experience certain forms of memories of the previous places that they were. And it's funny because actually my mother loves gardening so much, and having moved back to my parents' place as I transitioned to my new position, just going to the garden with her. My aunt is like, she's like in her 70s, and she has kidney failure, but she comes out in her little walker to the garden with her face mask, her goggles, and like her gloves, just to be out there in the air and to kind of try to pull away some weeds. But even though we can't be with them physically during this pandemic, we can still be at least 6 feet afar from them, and be able to talk around this space of cultivating food. So yeah.
And I agree with Dr. Mycey there too, because again, I talked a little bit about it. Hmong come from a agricultural background, and so coming to the United States, we still grow our own food in our backyard. And within the last 25 years, many Hmong elders have really saw the opportunity to growing their own food and being able to sell it. So for a while now, we begin to see that Hmong farmers are becoming part of a community that also provides food for the city, for the people within the city, whether it's across all races and ethnicities. And so I think that being able to utilize their skills to produce food for all American families is something that has really put a lot of pride to a lot of our Hmong elders. To be able to give is something that the Hmong is always very proud of doing. And Dr. Mycey was saying earlier about how food is something that is always welcoming. Well, our culture is, if we have a visitor coming into town and we run into them, we're all related one way or another through our clan names. And so then we invite them into our homes, and to share a meal is a must in our culture. And then now to be able to produce and share it with a wider community is something that I feel that many of our Hmong farmers are very proud of being able to offer.
Awesome. Thank you all so very much. We're getting close to the 1 o'clock hour, and what we'd like to do is to steadily move us into the Q&A. And some of the questions that we like to use to start this Q&A is to have our panelists respond to, how do we teach this in the classroom? How do we share these rich cultural experiences and narratives and ideas with young people? And so we're asking you all to, help us be better instructors and help us be better educators. So as we're thinking about this for the classroom, how can food and culture become teachable? What is it about the Milwaukee landscape related to the experiences of the LAO and Hmong communities? How can we share that information in the classroom in an effective way? So give us some tips on how to teach this stuff, if you don't mind.
I'm gonna jump in. I think you can't just teach food and culture out of context, right? I feel like what I've been trying to do during this talk was to really situate food in the kind of historical, social, economic, racial context that food is deeply embedded in. And I think sometimes we see food as symbolic of an ethnic community, right? And there is some questionable things around the idea that we can just consume people's foods and then all of a sudden know about them, right? But it's important to think about these foodways as the ways that they might map a migration of a people, and how it helps us to kind of understand more humanistic questions of change, turmoil, crisis, right? But also healing. So I think making it a teachable topic, I think to always teach it in context with history, and make sure that it's not, make sure it's not this kind of topic of the other, right? But making it a relational and reflective kind of discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Other panelists, you have thoughts about this? How do we do a better job teaching food and culture and history in the classroom?
I think you and Adam are kind of doing it right now. You know, besides reading out of an outdated book, we're having actual experts like Dr. Mai and MAYHOUA here, you know, having this conversation. I think is way more practical than, again, reading out of a book that's outdated.
Yeah.
So these conversations ultimately, I think, would give people more information than opposed to the traditional ways of, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sounds, just real quick, Alex, it almost feels like your food business was kind of a way of you getting there too, which is like you started sharing food almost kind of in a utilitarian way. Then you started putting your own spin on it. Then you saw it as sort of an entry point to share a broader story, right? Where like,
yeah,
you know, you can invite people together for a meal, but then, you know, once they're starting to appreciate it and enjoy it, you can kind of, you know, they're in a spot where they might be more open to listening to an experience that they're kind of surrounded by all the time, but might be unaware of.
You know how many people I've taught that were all not Chinese through egg rolls?
Yeah.
Just having that conversation, having them try them. Growing up in, you know, rural Wisconsin too, my neighbors were predominantly Caucasian. And, you know, it wasn't even their fault that they didn't know because they were never told like what happened in Laos. But back to the power with food too, I kind of want to elaborate, like in our situation being, you know, growing as a company, we always give it back to the local grocery stores. We're always buying food from them. We're getting our produce from Hmong farmers, not just because they're Hmong, because they grow the best produce, but you know, just keeping this ecosystem of supporting refugee businesses is a big role for us too that we like to take part in.
Yeah, and that's a good point about expertise too. You know, we oftentimes don't bring in the very real and the very important notions around expertise, particularly in these areas and topics where, you know, we all assume we can just go out and plant some seeds and grow something, but there is an expertise to the cultivation of fresh produce and then taking that and moving it into something that's very edible and culturally rich and culturally significant. MAYHOUA, did you want to jump in and say a few things?
I just want to say, reiterate that what Dr. Maisi and Alex had said, you know, are very important. Because whenever I'm asked to do presentations on culture and food, you know, you have to give that history about the culture, and then you introduce the food and how, you know, food are prepared, why it's prepared certain ways. Those are very important. So yeah, and I'm a visual person, and so to have this kind of visual really helps me understand, why do we use basil? Why does it have to be Thai basil versus the other basils that we can get at the regular mainstream grocery store? So these are things that are very important to me, because, you know, the specifics of why ingredients are put into certain dishes are very important. So to give that history, to give the culture, and then to introduce the food is, you know, is something that has to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you can't put a perspective to a full understanding of the culture and the food. And so, you know, I like this kind of environment for learning. But if we have to switch it over into a classroom when it's safe to do that, you know, it's going to have to be time. You know, is going to have to allow for introductions and, you know, to have real life samples to share with the students in order for them to understand.
I just want to say another thing that I think that didn't get brought up was anti-Asian sentiment.
Yes.
The importance of talking about food in context is to think about the racial politics around Asian food and Asian forms of food consumption. So when Hmong were settled and Southeast Asian refugees were settled into the US, it was the height of anti-Asian sentiment. And so I, as well as other Hmong and Laotian, you know, Cambodian refugees and Vietnamese refugees growing up during that time period, you know, really faced a lot of scrutiny around Asian and Southeast Asian food. that our food was gross, disgusting, lesser, right? And that was always in relationship to the other normative types of food, right? And when I say normative, it's about predominantly white foods. And so our food was always this disgusting other type of food, but it's so interesting to see the ways history has changed, and where now there's kind of this gentrification of ethnic foods, and that it's almost this like great thing to be consuming Southeast Asian foods. And so that in itself is kind of problematic, and I think teaching it in the classroom is really important to highlight, and it is very relevant and relevant to today's time with the pandemic and COVID-19, where you see high anti-Asian sentiment coming all over again. But also, why are people so obsessed about this meme that this person is eating a bat and that's how we have COVID-19, right? And so these are all very interconnected. So while we think and celebrate ethnic foods, we also have to see the flip coin of the times in which ethnic food becomes racialized and othered.
Great. Thank you very much for bringing that up. That's certainly critical in this moment. All of our attendees have been elevated to panelists. We just want to take a few more minutes, and then we got to let our panelists get back to their regularly scheduled programming. Folks, if you have any questions that you want to pose, please unmute yourselves and share a question or two, and then we'll get these folks out of here.
Can I offer one thing? Even just the role of food. So I just a quick anecdote from my own life. I'm half Chinese and half Irish, grew up in Milwaukee without actually knowing a tremendous number of Asian folks until I got to Morris Middle School, and there was a bigger Hmong population. And like for me growing up, to the point you're just making, Dr. THAO, like one of my very few connections to my own culture was the food we'd eat at home, but then also when we'd go out to Los Angeles to see my family, we'd go to my Uncle Dewey's restaurant, the new Formosa Cafe in East LA, and I like wouldn't really feel like I made sense until we sat down and started eating those noodles. Even amongst my big Chinese family being biracial, I felt like, do I fit here? Do I make any sense? And that food just felt like something that was comforting or healing or bonding. And then, so last year, almost exactly a year ago, when my wife and I got married, my uncle put together a tour of the city of LA, tracing our family's story through LA, through the different places we lived in, and where the highway was built over one of our homes, where my grandfather, who had a laundry, got one of his clients to buy land where he could build a house where there were restrictive real estate covenants against Chinese people. And like, I didn't know any of that history growing up, and actually neither did my cousins. So like, I want to point out, like, sometimes, and I'm not saying that the Chinese and the Lao Hmong experience are the same by any means, but like sometimes food can be that connection where like when you're growing up, it's something you have that just feels like something that you can own until like you have a curiosity when you're older to say like, now I want to know my family's story a little better. Cause like, I think like any young person growing up here, like I didn't have that connection, but yeah. So food, I guess in some ways I feel like, Alex, I feel like I can relate to the story that you're authoring a little bit through your own food of like having that connection, but then like when you get to a certain point, seeing the value in what your parents gave you and then wanting to move, like level that up within your own life, as opposed to it just being kind of the background of who you are.
Okay. That's good stuff. Well, folks, we have reached the 1 o'clock hour. We want to, as I mentioned, be respectful of our guests' time. Thank you so very much. Dr. THAO had to jump off already, but we really appreciate your time today, Aflex and MAYHOUA. We really want to highlight that your sharing and your education in this space is going to be very valuable for young people who get to experience this. Next week, we have another talk. We're going to be talking about urban farming, particularly in African-American communities in Milwaukee. And then we're going to have on July 30th, a conversation with educators in which we sort of digest what we've talked about this month and then share some teaching strategies that we've learned in these conversations. So Aflex, MAYHOUA, thank you so very much. Dr. THAO, we know you're gone. Thank you for your time today. We're going to wrap up our Facebook live stream right now. So thank you folks for joining us on Facebook. We appreciate you chiming in and adding to our conversation. We are no longer on Facebook. If there's any last question or two from the attendees, please let us hear those questions. Otherwise, we will wrap up our conversation today. Any other last questions from folks?
Yeah, so I have kind of with Adam's point and his story. I'm also biracial. My mom's from the Philippines. My dad's a white dude from New England. And whenever, and now I grew up on the West Coast. Now I live in Wisconsin. And whenever I call my aunts to ask specifically for recipes because I'm homesick and I grew up eating sort of Filipino foods, I'm told to Google it and to watch sort of a YouTube video on how to make it. And when I asked my cousins, they got the same response, which is our moms have sort of said, the internet exists, go to that for sort of your recipes. We don't want to teach you. Well, also, they're really bad teachers, so I'm okay with this. But I was wondering if you guys could speak to the sort of use of the digital in sharing sort of foodways, food traditions, cultural traditions, and how that might change or adapt. Because I've also realized I can say whatever I want about the Philippines. No one is going to correct me at all because of, you know, the color I am.
Well, I can jump in here, and then Alex, you fill in. I'm a mother of two young ladies in their late 20s, early 30s. You know, it's very hard to when you live in long distance like this, because my daughters are up in the Twin Cities and I'm here. So when they ask about cooking certain dishes, you know, I can talk to them over the phone and tell them what kind of ingredients. Sometimes I'd have to take pictures of how the labels look like so that they can get the right kind of items that they need to get at the Asian stores. And then I would have to walk them through how to chop it and how to slice meat and all that stuff. But, you know, one thing that we tend to like to refer our young people to the internet now is because there are so many people who have so much time on their hands that are cooking and videotaping it onto YouTube and posting it. And so that's probably one of the reasons why that if you do that, it's probably easier if you can see everything, where that person really had the time to really go through everything. But, you know, but then when we refer you young people to the internet, we lose that bonding that we have with you from the distance in miles. So as a mother, you know, very few times that if I don't know certain kind of food, you know, the recipes for certain things, I would say, well, Google it. But other than that, you know, I like to give them my side of my recipe, because you know, I like them to at least take a part of me with them.
Yeah. There's so much information out there. My mom even watches YouTube recipe videos now. It's pretty crazy. But I mean, they never scaled recipes either, so it's hard to be like, hey, mom, how much grams goes into here and yada yada. So maybe that's your best bet, is to get information from YouTube and trial and error, put the time in, and yeah.
Any other questions from our attendees? Anybody else?
I found out I was using the wrong soy sauce. Thank you. Yep.
MAYHOUA, I have a question for you. Did you ever try breakdancing?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, breakdancing came at a time when I was an adult, and plus I was always a shy person. So, and I was not very sporty, so I wouldn't even want to try it.
What would your breakdancing name have been in the world where you did become a breakdancer? Sorry, that was a very difficult question.
Still talking to me, Adam? Or
Yeah.
are you talking to Alex? You know, to be honest with you, I really don't know much about sports or dancing.
Well, on that, let's end our conversation before Adam asks some more questions.
Wait, I have one more thing. No, this isn't even a question, but Alex, I just had an idea for a progression of your logo of SAPSAP, where it's that first image, but then it becomes a multi-panel cartoon where you see you grow up start breakdancing and your mom kind of looking at you funny. And then the next one being like you making egg rolls with her. Then the next one being you making food and her looking at you a little less funny, but still a little funny. And then like the sort of the dialect of your life kind of back and forth of like that little boy kind of growing up and how your relationship with your mom changes.
I wish I had time for that. I'll leave that to the experts.
Well, folks, we thank you for your time today. We'll end our conversation and webinar right there. We certainly appreciate you. Attendees, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Some folks who've been there with us for a while, Kristen, Lisa, Abby as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next Wednesday. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.